Let's review just a little bit to get started tonight. Last week, we talked about the origins of humans. And so, what did we learn last week about the origins of all humans? I'll see how much retention is taking place in our class. Teachers always like to do that.
There's only one race of human beings.
Thank you, Peter. I would expect a good educator like you to come through for me like that. So that's exactly right. As we learned last week, that we all, regardless of skin color, come from a common origin, and that regardless of a person's skin color, because we have a common origin, we were all created originally from the image of God. But as we found, that hasn't kept people with evil intent from spreading hate. It hasn't kept people from vying for superiority. It hasn't kept people from oppressing others for their own power and material gain. And it's not always based on skin color. Peter has alluded because of the relation, because of Heath and Rebecca being in Rwanda, he has alluded to the genocide that has taken place in the nation of Rwanda between the Tutsis and the Hutus. There is a movie called Hotel Rwanda that I've been wanting to watch for years, but I only got to watch recently. There's a poignant part that I think illustrates kind of what we're talking about in this class, where the hopeful hotel manager, Paul, and I can't pronounce his last name very well, but it's based on a true story. Paul, the hotel manager, hopes that there is a rescue ahead. But his hopes are dashed when a Belgian military leader tells him, and this is a paraphrase, he says, "Paul, no one is coming to your rescue." Well, Paul has all these relationships that he thinks are really meaningful, deep relationships with all of these Europeans and Americans who have come to Rwanda, and that he is housed in his hotel. And he says, why? Why wouldn't they come? Why wouldn't they come to our rescue? And the Belgian military leader, looks at him and very pointedly says, "The color of your skin. They don't care about you." Now, did that really happen? I don't know, but it illustrated how the world reacted to what was going on in Rwanda. And it's that kind of disposition that we don't want to be a part of. That in this class, hopefully we can become more informed about. And so with that thought in mind, that reality in mind, I share this quote from Jafar Abdullah, who said, "To live as a Black is to live life as a threat." What do you think he means by that statement? And, those of us who are white probably, it is only speculation. Maybe some of you who are in class who are Black can better answer that question. So what do you think he means?
Watch your back.
Okay.
It's the way white people see Blacks.
Okay. Then it says that's the way some white people see blacks, that they don't see another human being. They see someone who is a danger or a threat to them for whatever reason they may think.
It's a reminder to stay in your place where you can't find it written, but it's an unwritten law that you're to stay in your place. You don't want to be what they used to call uppity, which could get you killed.
Okay. And so not only are blacks seen by many whites as a threat, but as Charles is pointing out, if you don't keep your, and you said keep your place, the implication is your lower place. If you're considered, if you begin to behave or talk in an uppity way, you may be in danger. Other
That is
thoughts?
correct, because there was a point when I was growing up, and I was told by my father, you know, as you grow up as a teenager and go downtown, never look a white man in his eye, because he takes that as a threat.
Okay. So again, these kinds of things, and I so appreciate, Charles, you speaking from your experience. These things are eye-opening for people like me. That you would be given that kind of instruction by your father at an early age, because your father had the awareness that blacks were viewed as threats for whatever reason. Other thoughts about what all could be implied in Jafar Abdullah's statement?
Dale, I don't know what you understand, but there is also what we call pseudoscience racism. Back in the Darwin time, they came out with the evolution chart of man, to the ape, to the gorilla, to the Neanderthal, to the first ape sapien. And then they had the next one, which had Negroid features. Then the modern sapien. And that was not removed till the early 1920s. So even it was coming from all directions.
Yes. And we may talk a little bit more about that, Tim, about the place that Darwin and evolution played in that. But you're illustrating once again all of this information, all of this, and I'm going to call it what it is, all this propaganda that was used in order to paint blacks in a certain way so that there would be certain attitudes, generalizations, prejudices, racisms held against them through the years. Things still abide in the hearts of people today.
You kind of froze there for a while, Dale, and we missed some of what you were saying.
It was really good, Charles. I hate that you missed it, and I don't know if I can repeat it again. But the short of it is that all of the misrepresentations and lies that have been used to perpetuate racism and prejudice, it was propaganda that we now know is not true. But yet it still abides in the hearts of some people today, even though it's not true. And so we're going to talk about some more of that tonight. In fact, our son Jared was at Harding. He overlapped with Botham Gene about a year. I'm sure that many of you remember. In fact, I shared a video clip of the courtroom scene of Botham Gene. Those of you who remember the case of a police officer by the name of Amber Geiger in the Dallas area, where she came home one evening, entered the apartment that she thought was hers, saw a black man in the apartment eating ice cream. She had a gun and told him to get up, and he did with protest. And she ended up shooting him and killing him, saying that she feared for her life. The reality about Botham Jean is that he was a beloved, highly esteemed student at Harding University. He often led worship. He was a song leader for many of the chapel gatherings at Harding University. So he had shown no threat, but the reality of how things unfolded is that there seemed to be, with this unarmed man that she thought was a threat, there seemed to be overtones of racism and prejudice in her decision to shoot and to kill him. Now, that's what Jafar Abdullah was talking about. Simply because his color of his skin was black, an unarmed man eating ice cream was deemed as a threat. What is remarkable to me, and I showed it in a video that of the courtroom scene in one of my sermons as an illustration of mercy and forgiveness, is in the actual courtroom scene, Botham Jean's brother is there, and he is speaking about his own grief. And Amber Geiger, the police officer who was on trial for his murder, is weeping uncontrollably. And his brother asks the judge, "Can I go give her a hug?" As he talks about forgiving her and hoping that this will lead to a change in her life. That doesn't sound like a threat to me. And so again, some of the prejudices and race and generalizations that continue on through today reveal that some of this is planted deeply within the hearts of some of us who are white. And especially as people of God, we want to make sure that that's not something that is within us. In a meeting that, the Truth and Reconciliation meeting that Jim Beck has been having, one of the things that stood out to me about the panel that spoke that day of Black men and women was that Blacks live with the constant fear of violence against them. They're often viewed as dangerous, as a threat, but in reality, there's constant fear of violence against them. And so maybe this is just speculation here, maybe the defensiveness or cautiousness sometimes is misinterpreted. But I just find the misunderstandings between humans in this way remarkable and disturbing. In fact, you've probably heard the phrase over the last several months, there are two different Americas. Well, I think the storming of the Capitol building on January the 6th probably illustrates that well. Think about this. When the Black Lives Matter marches were being held, the National Guard was called out to meet any violent resistance. When Trump supporters were given access, or excuse me, when Trump supporters stormed the Capitol building, they were given access and directions with little resistance. I think that should cause pause for God's people particularly. And so I better understand when I hear a Black person say, America's not my country, or the Capitol is not my capital, because all the prejudice that we're talking about leads to a sense of being disenfranchised, that I don't belong here. And again, I think for as God's people who are supposed to be shedding light on our world, we should be very disturbed about that and be proponents of what is right and what is true. I've done a lot of talking to begin, and I'm going to ask some, move on to the next question shortly, but I'm curious about your reactions to what I have just shared with you over the last few minutes. Yes, Dan.
I've been listening today since I've been just in the house, been listening to, some of the trial and stuff that's been going on. And one thing in particular, I think it was the Black officer, the one that led the people away from the senators and stuff. He said he had been called nigger at least 15 times. And after, it was all over, he was telling another friend, Black police officer, he said, I can't believe this just happened. And he said, I'm sick of this. And he used a bad word, but, he was just sick of the fact, being called that name and what had just happened, at the Capitol.
It's understandable why he would be tired of that after experiencing that just that short time. But imagine that's your whole life experience. I understand better why there would be such frustration and anger. Other reactions?
Dale, this is Peter.
Yes, Peter.
One of the places we've watched some of this play out, of course, has been in sports, in professional sports. And of course, we all know or should know the story of Jackie Robinson. And if you read all the things about him, and he had to be hand chosen because he was told, you're going to carry the burden for your whole race. And this is just going to be a start, and it's going to be brutal, and it's going to be awful, and it's going to be terrible. But we got a lot of guys good enough to play at that level, but we don't have everybody that's got your courage. And yet, one of the things that breaks my heart is when he wrote his biography. Do you know what the title of the book was? The title of the book was "I Never Had It Made." Well, he rose to the top of his sport and led the way for many, many, many other situations where his courage showed through. And yet men like him and like Jesse Owens, you know, never got but just token little blessings out of their sport the way so many others do, that just become heroes and get endorsements. And, you know, he died a bitter man, and his wife had to try to just prop him up as he carried the burden for his race. And so when you see that, you know, as soon as the line was broken, you know, when we had a chance to get in, you know, more blacks into professional sports, even there, you know, they had to face it decade after decade. And that says, you know, it says a lot about, you know, where we made some good steps, but we still got to fight against, you know, all the cruelty that's gone on.
Yeah. Our family went in 2003 to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and there's lots to see at the Baseball Hall of Fame. So for something to stand out, it had to be pretty remarkable. But I do remember going into the area where they talked about the integration of blacks into Major League Baseball, and seeing letters, death threats against Jackie Robinson. And so that's one of the things that stood out to me by going to the Baseball Hall of Fame. Again, I'm trying to imagine, and I'm trying to help those of us who've never experienced anything like that. But I'm trying to imagine what that would be like, having that kind of stress and pressure on me, as Peter has talked about, every day. And as Peter also alluded to, he died a bitter man, and his wife, and the documentaries I have watched about his life, says very clearly that he died prematurely because of the stress and strain and pressure that he dealt with throughout his life. Again, I hope that builds a certain amount of sympathy and compassion, and in some cases, outrage, as we talk about instances like this. So turn your Bibles to Genesis chapter 6. Somebody read verses 5 and 6, and then verses 11 through 13.
The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled.
11 through 13.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right.
So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence.
Okay. There is a history behind racism and prejudice and evil. And so I wanted us to read Genesis 6, 5 and 6 and 11 through 13 to see it more clearly. What was God grieved about, and why did he want to destroy the earth?
He was grieved about the humans becoming wicked and evil and corrupt.
There's a word that he uses twice.
What?
In Genesis 6, 5 and 6, and verses 11 through 13, he uses one word twice. What is it?
Violence.
Violence. Violence. I don't know how many of you, I remember this because of my years as a youth minister, because we talk about movies that we would go to, and kids would always come back and say, yeah, it's rated R, but it's just rated R because of violence, as if violence was an insignificant thing, and that's no big deal. The implication was, if it had sex in it, okay, I understand somewhat, but violence, what's the big deal about violence? Well, what is God telling us about how he views violence?
He views it as sin, for one thing.
Well, violence leads to death. And if you look at in there, when he talks about who's going to suffer from this, it's the animals. And most people miss that God made the earth and everybody in it to be vegetarian. And so, even the animals suffered for this. And if you've ever watched, some great National Geographic about lions and zebras, and you watch them pull down a half-grown zebra and rip it to shreds and eat it while it's still alive, that's part of what the planet suffered over violence. And there's so much violence today still going on.
Violence.
In tonight's news, the violence is escalating against the Asians, especially in California.
So violence is not something that we should turn our heads away and say, oh, it's just violence. This was something so deplorable to God that he said, we got to start over. I have to start the whole thing over through Noah. So Rita Carey, and Rita's with us, Rita Carey was thoughtful enough to share with me a book that was first published in 1895 by a woman by the name of Ida B. Wells, and the name of the book is The Red Record. It introduced me to the phrase lynch laws, which is about lynching or hanging of people without due process of law, where private citizens took the law into their own hands and carried out what their own sense of what is just and right. This book was written as a successor to the brutality of slave ownership, where in many cases masters kept their slaves in line. That's the phrase that was used. Kept their slaves in line by violence or threats of violence or murder. And in Ida B. Wells' book, The Red Record, she highlights 10,000 killings, or says that she's able to verify 10,000 killings by lynch law where there was no trial. And of those 10,000 killings, only 3 men were brought to justice. 3 white men were brought to justice. So she documented lynchings of black men. In one case that was acquitted of murder by a white jury, but vigilantes, citizens taking the law into their own hands, took the black man out and hung him, even though he had been acquitted of murder in a court of law. She documents in the book lynchings for wife abuse, lynchings for accusations of stealing hogs, accusation of talking saucy to white people. That was the phrase, talking saucy to white people. Charles kind of alluded to that earlier. For no offense at all, or a quarrel over the amount of change given in a purchase, a lynching when someone was accused but was innocent of poisoning a well. And the defense of these lynch laws were essentially summarized into three. Number one, to stamp out race riots. That we need lynch laws, we need white people taking the law into their own hands to stamp out race riots. Two, the argument that it's a white man's government, so whites should rule. And there was a movement to minimize the right to vote for black men. And number three, the justification for lynch laws was to avenge the assaults upon women, in particular rapes of women.
White women.
White women particularly, but even I mean, I think even there was a desire to find any reason to do it.
I agree with that.
Yeah. And so it didn't matter, but it was particularly offensive if it was the rape of a white woman. So the parallel I'm drawing here is that God looked down at violence with tremendous disdain. But slavery and racism and prejudice have been perpetuated largely because of violence. The fear that many people live in, that many black people live in today, is because of the history of violence. I don't remember if I mentioned this last week or not, but I saw an old Louis Farrakhan, Henry was the one, Henry had sent me this clip, an old Louis Farrakhan interview on, what's that guy's name? He was silver-haired, the talk show. No, daytime talk show. Anyway, Louis Farrakhan said, there is not a history of whites attacking violently, or excuse me, of blacks violently attacking whites. But there is a history of whites attacking blacks. There's also black on black, as we alluded to in the Rwandan genocide. And so it's interesting how history is perhaps distorted in its presentation. That people feel threatened when a black person is around, when in reality, a black person has really more understanding and justification for a white person being around. Yeah.
Hey, Dale, can I interject something here?
Yeah.
I just noticed there where if there's an elevator and a white lady's on the elevator and the black man comes on there, the first thing she does is get in the corner and grab her purse.
Yeah. Feeling threatened. Yeah. And the interview I was talking about was Phil Donahue. It was on the Phil Donahue show. Was there somebody else who was about to make a comment? So let's read on. Let's go to Isaiah 30, verse 18, and Psalm 9, verse 16. Somebody who's got that, if you would read Isaiah. Yeah, go ahead.
Therefore, the Lord is waiting to show you mercy and is rising up to show you compassion. For the Lord is a just God. All who wait patiently for him are happy.
What do we learn about the nature of God from this passage? The character of God. What's the last phrase?
Just.
He's a just God. He is a God of justice. Psalm 9, verse 16.
The Lord has revealed himself. He has executed justice, striking down the wicked by the work of their hands.
Again, what do we learn about the nature of God? He is a God of justice. What does the fact that God is a God of justice mean for racism? I've just been sharing with you examples from the past of white humans taking the law into their own hands without any kind of due process of law. So what does it mean for us in this discussion about racism that God is a God of justice? In fact, Deuteronomy 7 verse 6 and Deuteronomy 19:15, under the law of Moses, you could only be convicted if there were at least 2 witnesses to a crime. What does this tell us? About racism?
It's a law unto itself.
Okay, it's kind of people taking the law into their own hands, the law unto itself. Somebody else was about to say something.
Under Torah law, God thought so much of justice was that if you perjured yourself, there are large sections about perjury in the law. Okay? If you perjure yourself in a court of law under oath, that's proven, you get the punishment that a person who testified would have gotten. And that went for all types of things. I can remember, being taught one way or another in a history class or something we got, was that, to swear under oath. I know I grew up with the feeling or with the teaching that if you do that, that's an unforgivable sin. You put your hand on the Bible and lie. And people would not lie under oath. And of course, when they do and when they can and no one prosecutes it, then your justice system is gone.
So understanding that God is a God of justice and that he takes, as Peter is pointing out, he takes words of an oath, of testimony very seriously, should speak to us loudly about making sure that people do get due process of law regardless of what their skin color is. Because that's the nature of God. And for us to to be a part of anything else, or to turn away and act like we don't see it, would be a failing on our part. So there is the need to be like the character of our Father, to be people of justice. So proper justice should be given to anyone guilty of crime, even when those crimes are carried out against people who have traditionally been oppressed and treated as inferior in the past. Because what we've learned, and this is moving into the biology aspect of our study tonight, what we've learned is that skin color is truly only skin deep. Okay? Melanin is the broad term to describe skin pigment. Now, it includes all shades of brown. And so if you want to see what that looks like, make a trip to Home Depot or to Lowe's sometime and go to the paint section and get a palette of all the browns. Okay? And you know what you're going to find? You're going to find in the palette of all the browns, all the skin colors across the planet. All right? We all have the same skin pigment, this melanin. The shade of brown that each of us has depends on which type and how much melanin we have. And let me illustrate it. My great-grandmother, her name was Victoria. Victoria was an American Indian or a Native American. Now, I put that our children were 1/8 or 1/16 or whatever when they started school. They were 1/18 or 1/16 Native American, and people would look at me like Jared, or like look at me or look at Jared, our redheaded, very fair-skinned son, and say, "You don't have any Native American in your background," but I do. Now, you don't see it in my skin pigment, okay? You don't see it in my skin pigment, and you don't see it in our son Jared. But my sister Vicky, who was named after my great-grandmother Victoria, turns very, very brown during the tanning months of the summer. And if you looked at her and you looked at me, you would wonder how we could be related if you were looking just at skin color. Now, we have a lot of similarities facially beyond that, but you would wonder if you simply judged by color of skin. But we all have this melanin, and those of you who are in class tonight, who are physicians and study biology more in depth than I have, could speak to this more. But when the Human Genome Project unlocked the DNA code around the year 2000, that was a remarkable achievement that's led to all kinds of breakthroughs in other ways. But what they scientifically proved when they unlocked the DNA code is that there is only one human race. There's only one race, the human race, that we all have the same, again, background. We all have the same genetic basis. And skin color is just a matter, essentially, of how close you are to the equator. So there is no biological basis for race. And all the presentations that we've talked about in previous class lessons, especially in class lesson 2, were faulty and biased. people already had their conclusion. They were just looking for sketchy ways to prove it. React to that.
No, Dale?
Yeah.
It depends on the latitude and the angle of the sun. You agree to that. Our ancestors, the ones in Norway, are fair-skinned, light-skinned. The ones in Egypt, Africa, are dark-skinned because of the large amount of melanin, which was passed on to each generation. So we can look at our ancestors. That's how we know where they came from. That's what's interesting. But they're all the same. You put one of those Norwegians, leave them in Africa, and about 4 generations down, they'll have dark-skinned children.
Exactly. Exactly. And again, this points out the faulty, deceptive ways that racism has been justified in the past.
Hey, Dale, can I make a comment also, please?
Yeah, and that's part of what I'm trying to point out. Go ahead.
Okay, back in the days of slavery, whenever the master wanted to have a slave girl, he would have her, and she would bear a child, and that child would be fair-skinned, but he would be raised as a slave because of his mother is black.
Yeah. Yeah. It would not have been socially acceptable in those days to have owned up, I guess you would say, to the slave owner parentage. So here's what I want us to understand, I guess, as we talk about all of this deceptive propaganda that's been used over the centuries to justify slavery and racism and prejudice. In the words of one of the black men in the Truth and Reconciliation meetings that I've told you about, slavery is a relational dynamic. In other words, he was saying that attitudes and treatment continue even today, despite the laws being changed. So I may not be able to go and bid and buy another human being who has dark skin, but do my actions, do my attitudes somehow reveal a slavery mentality? It shouldn't be that way, certainly among the people of God.
Well,
yes.
Back in the 1500s, 1600s, when Portugal and Spain divided up the New World, if they were a Christian nation, they couldn't be conquered. But if there were no Christian nations, they could be conquered. Well, there's no Christians in that, So whatever they conquered, not only the land, but the people belonged to them. And that has carried down.
Yes. And again, as the conquerors, they were superior, right? And the ones that they conquered were inferior. And so you see how all of this has developed through the centuries and how it's become a part of the mindset that some people have, that they're not even aware of, that they've adopted. And I'm hoping that in this class to expose that and hopefully destroy that. That's my hope through this class. Other reactions, comments, questions tonight?
Hey, Dale. Also, it's kind of a little off track of what you're saying, but also the same thing happens in the justice system because you have a lot of, more Black people, in jail, or the sentences are different, many times for Black people, than they are for white people. And and I sent Lori. It's been a while. The name of a movie, and it's called When They See Us, and it's about these Black boys that were accused of raping a white woman and beating her. And long story short, you know, they didn't do it, but they were kind of railroaded into saying that they did it. But the guy, which was a white guy, he eventually confessed, you know, to the crime years later. But by that time, I'd already been jailed, you know, for some years. And so they call it the Central Park 5 now, I think, but the movie is called When They See Us by Ava DuVernay. It's a really good movie. It does have, you know, a little language in it, but it's a true story. And they did get a settlement, you know, afterwards, but, you know, it came out that they were just, you know, really railroaded, where they were just trying to pin it on them because they were Black and they were poor, and they did, you know, they had to come up with this plea so that they wouldn't get life. But, you know, they were poor, they didn't have money for attorneys, and so, you know, they were stuck in jail for a crime that they didn't commit.
And sadly, what Tammy is saying, that story has been played out numerous times in our country's history. And so
Dale?
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Dale, one of the things that we're blessed with today that 2 or 3 generations ago didn't have, there are wonderful, wonderful professional movies now being made that for us white folks, okay, we can go places and teach our kids and have our kids sit down and watch these important films like The Help, like Hidden Figures, like all the great, great things that are being made by both white and Black directors. They're out there. And so, you know, I showed lots of those kind of things to our kids, just like, in the same way I had them show things about the Holocaust. In other words, they need to have seen those things. They need to have heard these things. And so there's a lot of things out there for those of us that by our upbringing, we're not in an environment where we would have learned these lessons. They're out there for us. And they are, many of them are marvelously done, and they rip your guts out, but our kids need to see them. And we need to have seen them, because that does help. In other words, when we're sheltered, if we don't have that, we may be innocent of thinking that the world's all like our little corner. And so, you know, I recommend that to all of us, and to people that have young children at the right time. They need to see those things.
That's a great point. I remember showing our children things like Ruby Bridges and Rosa Parks, and the great questions that my children had afterward that were kind of hard to explain to them because in their innocent minds, it just didn't make sense. So I hope we will all come away with a greater sense of our God being a just God, and that we become more and more advocates for his justice for all people. May you be blessed tonight, and please stay warm. Hopefully we will see you on Sunday. Have a good night. Bye-bye.